It's so interesting, isn't it? I know. So I've spoken to quite a few people, and I just think it might be helpful for me just to kind of preface this so that the audience are aware. So we're kind of talking here about, I guess, the hard problem of consciousness, right? Kind of how it is that material beings have an experience of what something is like. So it's like something to be you, to drink a cup of coffee, to have that smell, to have that sort of qualia experience. It's referred to quite often. And the issue here, we're saying again for the audience, is that the sort of step from a material thing to a conscious immaterial experience is how do you get from one to the other? That is the hard problem of consciousness. Quite often when I'm talking to atheists or people who are philosophers of mind from a sort of more materialistic stance, as you already mentioned, they're kind of saying that there is this thing which is a human, which is a material object, and then through evolution we have kind of enabled this consciousness to emerge within our psyche, and we can have these sort of qualia experiences. Or, as you've already said, the other way is to kind of turn around and say, well, actually those things that we think we're having feelings and thoughts, we're actually not. They are illusions essentially. Or we begin to try and eliminate certain things. Say, well, if it is true that we are mindless and we've come from a mindless process, adding mind to it isn't possible, so therefore the end result must be that there is no mind within that sort of the consciousness. There is just an inanimate sort of human brain that feels like it might be having these things, but it isn't actually. I find very often that within the atheist circles, it's very easy just to say, well, of course it is emergent, like consciousness must have emerged, and there's no other way to look at it. That must be how it happens. You look at a tree is potentially conscious in some very, very vague sense. You look at a bat, as Thomas Nagel would, and you say, okay, a bat, there is something that it's like to be a bat. And you look at a dog, and there's something a little bit more there. And then you look at human, and there's even more there. And it just seems to be this slow sort of trickling up or down of consciousness, depending on how I guess highly evolved the being is. And they'll point to that and say, well, that is proof that consciousness is emergent, and it must be that starting from mindless matter, we begin to get mindful things. How do you begin to kind of address that sort of I'm aware it's a very classic statement, but how do you begin to kind of address that and begin to push into actually mind might be more fundamental than maybe we're realizing through our sort of classic evolutionary view of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it opens up many different concepts that I find it helpful to just begin to sort of separate certain concepts and offer some clarifications. So first thing I just want to say right off the bat that in my own work, I actually offer a theory of emergence. So I do think there's a sense in which conscious states, like a state of a feeling or state of thinking, does emerge. Okay, it emerges. But then the deep question that I'm asking, and many are asking, is what does it emerge from? And so I think it's helpful to kind of make a distinction between the states of consciousness and then the subject or the being that's conscious. So for example, I could have a state of thinking about you. And so that there's the consciousness of thinking about you. But then there's also the me, the subject of that conscious state. And so one observation that I would make is that states of consciousness might in some ways emerge in a context where there's already a subject, some kind of bearer of the conscious state, something that can have the conscious states. So now we can separate two questions. One question is, where do the conscious states emerge from? Okay, what's the material that can make mind or consciousness? The second question is, where does the subject or the substance or the being, or however you want to characterize it, that the thing that is conscious, where does it emerge from? Could it even emerge? And in thinking about both those questions, I think it's very helpful to make a distinction between materials that could produce consciousness, okay, materials that we can see can't produce consciousness, and then materials where we can't really see one way or the other. They're sort of agnostic about it. And so you can sort between these cases. And I think it is helpful to illustrate these cases with examples. So let's start with materials that can't make consciousness, okay? Here would be an example I think would be pretty uncontroversial among those in the audience. I mean, there might be some exceptions here. But the material of the number 9 wouldn't be able to produce the feeling of love all on its own. Like 9 isn't the right kind of material, okay, to make the feeling. So that would be just like an example where I think one can sort of see by insight into the nature of the number and the nature of the feeling that the feeling doesn't come from the number 9. Okay, so that would be a case where you could sort of see the material is wrong. Here's a case where I think maybe you could see that the material is the right kind of material to form a feeling. If the material is a conscious being like you or me, then I think that we can actually witness through introspection the formations of thoughts and feelings that arise from that kind of a being. Okay. Now here's the material, and we could say more about, well, what is the nature of that being, and am I relocating the mystery of the consciousness to the mystery of the nature of the being? And in some ways I am. I mean, part of the project then is to understand, well, what kind of a being could produce thoughts and feelings? But let me just set that aside and just illustrate this third idea that maybe there are some materials where it's sort of unclear whether it could produce consciousness or not. And let's say you're looking out at a beach and there's some sand blowing in the wind, and you're not quite sure if the sand on its own could start thinking or feeling, because you're not really quite sure what kind of a material that sand is. Okay. Now, if you're not sure what it is, I want to be careful about making a kind of argument from ignorance that says, hey, you know what? I don't see how it could produce consciousness. Therefore, it couldn't produce consciousness. I don't want to make that kind of an inference. However, if there's a known material that can produce states of consciousness, then I want to try to build my theory in terms of what's known as far as I can, if that makes sense. And also, through a little bit careful attention to what it means to be sand, I think it is possible, and I think this takes kind of concentration, analytical surgery, but I think it is possible, and I make an argument for this from different directions, to see that at least certain aspects of sand couldn't be the whole story in explaining the emergence of first-person feelings and thoughts. And I think this is actually what Rosenberg is seeing insightfully. He's looking at certain aspects, spatial aspects, motions, aspects characterized by fundamental physics, where he's arguing that you can't just change elements of sand and just in virtue of those kind of third-person spatial or functional, where the functions are in terms of the spatial aspects, in basic physical aspects, would just on their own be able to start having those first-person feelings. Okay, if the first-person feelings have that kind of subjective quality that they may seem to have from your first-person perspective, that's where I think you can get this kind of construction challenge. And I would make the argument that certain kinds of materials, certain kinds of explanations like that, it's not just mysterious. How could it be? That through insight into the relevant natures, and again, I think this takes work. You have to concentrate on the natures, focus on the shape of a triangle, focus on the feeling of love. Can that shape just all on its own be the basis for the feeling of love? And what I would make the argument that there can be correlations between certain shapes and certain mental states. Like if you read an email, the email has certain shapes in the text, and then you could decode certain mental states that you're interpreting the message behind the email. And that there can be law-like connections between certain shapes and certain mental states. But those law-like connections are already pointing to a deeper explanation. It's not the shapes on their own that's doing all the explanatory work. There's something deeper in. And so then this leads back to the question, well, what could link conscious states with other states? And here my general strategy is to appeal to materials as far as I can that are known to be able to produce consciousness, and then remove from my theory materials that are known not to be able to produce consciousness, if that makes sense. And so that's a general strategy for thinking about this. And when we then come to emergent views, I want to distinguish between different kinds of emergent views. Emergent views that appeal to materials that either, I think, by certain reflection can be shown to not be able to produce the relevant data, versus emergent views where you're actually appealing to materials that can produce the relevant data. So I do actually, in the end, argue for a kind of emergentism. It's just I need the right material, if that makes sense.
If you enjoyed this clip, then head on over to Locals to access the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version, and everyone can access the audio-only version of the conversation. I'll see you over there.